People ask me sometimes why I still go up. I am 71 years old. My knees ache in the cold of the transit corridors, and the platform's recycled air does something to my sinuses that no medication has ever quite fixed. I retired from the Accord Watch 12 years ago, and I have a perfectly acceptable apartment in the Calais Shore residential tier, with a window that faces the water and a kettle that I trust completely, and a neighbor who does not knock unless there is something genuinely wrong. I have no professional reason to be on an orbital defense platform at this age, or at any age. The Accord stopped requiring my presence at formal proceedings several years before my retirement. What they still require, or rather, what the Accord Registry still requires is my memory, my 34 years of institutional knowledge, and my signature on the decennial review documentation. They could accept those things remotely. They always offer to accept them remotely, and every 10 years I come up anyway. There is a particular quality to the silence on a working orbital platform that I have never found anywhere else. Not the silence of absence. The silence of a great deal of careful effort being made by many people at once, all of it disciplined enough that it produces no unnecessary sound. When I was young and newly assigned to the Careth Vale as a junior watch officer, that silence used to make me feel small and temporary. Now it makes me feel settled. Like sitting in a building you helped to design and finding that it still stands. But when the Careth Vale went to priority amber last month, I was already aboard. I had been up for 6 days as a civilian observer, reviewing the 34-year institutional record of the Vailketh Sanctuary Review, the great formal accounting that the Accord conducts every decade to verify that a granted sanctuary remains honored, that the resident population is stable and integrated, that no clause of the original protection agreement has lapsed or been allowed to grow ambiguous through administrative inattention. I am the only living human who participated in the original grant. That makes me useful to the archivists, and archivists do not much care about my knees or my sinuses, or the fact that I have not slept more than 4 consecutive hours on an orbital platform since my early 40s. So I was there when the Vailketh Sovereignty Armada crossed the outer marker. 29 vessels, Colonial Reclamation Authority, flying the ascending seal of the Vailketh Sovereignty Reclamation Directorate, a legal body that had not existed when the original refugees arrived, because 34 years ago the Vailketh Sovereignty did not exist. It had collapsed 51,000 years before that morning, scattered across 9 star systems in one of the great species fractures that the Accord's historical division catalogs and does not fully understand. The people I had helped to settle on Earth were the last coherent fragment of a civilization that had been dead longer than our species had walked upright. Their cultural preservation cache, the ship's library, everything the Vailketh had committed to durable storage before the collapse, ran to approximately 400 million pages of primary documents, and the Accord's archival team had spent 22 of the preceding 34 years cross-referencing and annotating it against the living knowledge the refugees carried in their own memories and their children's educations. 400 million pages of a dead civilization, slowly made legible again by the patience of living archivists who would never meet the people who wrote it. And now, out of the dark, something wearing that civilization's name had come to take the refugees back. I stood at the observation port on Deck 7 and watched the Armada's formation lights arrange themselves against the star field, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, exactly. I had been afraid many times in my years on the wall, afraid in the productive way that makes you careful, afraid in the useless way that makes you freeze, afraid in the particular way that comes at 3 in the morning when you are watching an approach vector, and you are not certain the math is going to work in humanity's favor. I knew what fear felt like in all its variations, at all hours. This was older than fear and quieter than fear. This was the feeling of watching something you had spent a long time believing was finished prove, with patient luminescence, that it was not. Behind me, Somewhere in the structured corridors of the Karath Vale, the Accord response fleet was already in position. I had seen the deployment numbers when I boarded 6 days earlier. Before any of this began, 412 warships, staged in the Calath deep shadow on the far side of the platform's sensor reach, where they had been sitting for 19 years as part of the routine defensive posture that the Accord maintains around all active sanctuary platforms. 61 orbital defense platforms on full active status. The Armada's 29 vessels, if they had attempted any kind of direct engagement, would have lasted perhaps 3 minutes under even a partial deployment of that force. The Accord does not share such calculations with arriving parties. The Accord does not threaten. It waits, and it has learned, across a very long institutional history of waiting, that waiting backed by genuine preparation is a form of speech that most species eventually understand without needing to be told. What I did not know, standing at that observation port watching the formation lights in the dark, was that the next 12 hours would not be decided by warships at all. I found out when the door to observation room 4 opened behind me and she walked in. I recognized her immediately, even though I had not seen her in 11 years. The Velkith do not age the way we do. Their cellular cycling runs at a different pace, and Sail looked perhaps 30 years old by any human measure, which meant she was actually closer to 90 in chronological terms. She was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply gotten shorter. Both things are possible when enough years have passed, and neither party has been keeping close account of the physical changes. Her secondary eye membranes were fully extended in the particular way that signals tension among her people, a reflex they cannot entirely suppress any more than a human can suppress the tightening of the jaw under accumulated stress. And her communication filaments, the narrow bioluminescent structures that run along the jawline and temple in Velkith anatomy, were cycling through a pale amber that I had learned, over many years of close attention, to read as controlled anxiety. The effort of controlling it rather than the anxiety itself, the distinction matters. She was wearing an Accord Cultural Liaison badge on her collar, senior classification. I had not known she worked for the Accord. I had not known much about the specific shape of her adult life, because 11 years had passed, and our correspondence had been occasional and warm, but not detailed. The kind of correspondence that maintains a relationship across distance without fully accounting for what the distance has changed in either person. She had been 11 years old when I first met her. That is not precisely right. The Velkith do not count age the way we do, and the concept of childhood is complicated in a species whose juveniles achieve most adult cognitive function within 2 years of emergence, meaning that what we might call childhood is brief, and what we might call adolescence extends considerably longer than in humans. But she had been young and small for her developmental stage, and she had attached herself to me during the first weeks of the sanctuary review proceedings in a way that her older sister Vila, the formal liaison officer of the Velkith refugee delegation, the one I worked with in an official capacity, had found either touching or mildly professionally embarrassing depending on the day and her state of exhaustion. Vila was responsible for representing her people in complex legal proceedings while simultaneously managing the emotional needs of 1,100 survivors who had never expected to be refugees and were not certain they would survive being so. She had limited energy to monitor her younger sister's activities. Sail had learned to speak Accord Standard in approximately 3 weeks. I had timed it, because the speed of it genuinely astonished me, and I wanted to have an accurate record of having been astonished. She had sat in the corner of the briefing room during the formal sessions, not interfering, not asking questions in front of the official parties, simply watching my mouth and my hands with the focused and patient intensity that the Velkith bring to any pattern they have decided they are going to understand. By week 4, she was asking me questions directly, in Accord Standard, bypassing her sister's real-time translations entirely. Her questions were the kind a person asks when they are trying to understand not just the words themselves, but the logical architecture that holds the words up and gives them their meaning. Why does the Accord use the word sanctuary and not the word protection? What is the practical legal difference between a grant and a guarantee? When humans say we will not forget, what is the enforcement mechanism for that promise? Do humans forget? What happens when they do? I told her the truth each time. I said that sanctuary carried a long and specific legal history in the Accord Charter, and that protection was a narrower term with different precedential weight in case law. I said that a grant created obligations recorded formally in law and reviewed on a fixed, mandatory schedule, while a guarantee required a living guarantor who might die or change their mind, and the Accord had learned over generations that it preferred to build its commitments into structures that outlasted the individuals who made them. I said that the enforcement mechanism for We Will Not Forget was the Accord Registry, which maintained its records in triplicate across 3 physically separate archival systems, and was reviewed by 3 independent institutional bodies on overlapping schedules, such that any lapse or alteration would be noticed and formally flagged within a single review cycle. She had looked at me for a long time after that last answer. The secondary membranes had been retracted, which meant she was not tense but thinking. Then she had said, in her still imperfect Accord standard, the Accord standard of a person who has been speaking it for 4 weeks and is building the grammar from first principles in real time, the sentence that I have remembered without effort for the 34 years since, I think your people built something we did not. I had said, yes, we did. And it took a very long time, and we made many mistakes along the way, and we nearly lost it more than once, and keeping it requires more continuous effort from more people over more generations than most of those people know when they first commit to it. But yes, we built it. She closed the door of observation room 4 behind her now, and stood with her back against it. The amber in her communication filaments did not change. Oren, she said. Sail, I said, I didn't know you were aboard. I came up on the emergency transit 2 days ago when Kareth Vale went to priority amber. She looked past me at the observation port, at the armada's lights arranged in the dark like a set of facts that had not yet finished being stated. They are filing under the Valekith Colonial Continuity Act, Section 7, Mandatory Repatriation Authority. I knew Section 7. I had read every document in the Valekith legal archive over the 34 years of my association with the Sanctuary Review. First, as a formal obligation of the watch officer role I held at the time of the original grant, and then, as a practice that had long since outgrown any professional requirement and had become simply part of what I did with my time. Section 7 was the provision that allowed a reconstituted Valekith sovereign authority to demand the return of diaspora populations that had settled under non-Valekith jurisdiction during the period of sovereignty collapse. It had been written approximately 47,000 years before the refugees arrived on Earth. It had never been invoked, because until now there had been no reconstituted authority with sufficient legal standing to invoke it. The Accord counterfiling, I said, is transmitting now, 318 million pages. The legal team has been building it for 22 years. She finally looked directly at me, away from the port and the formation lights. It addresses Section 7 comprehensively. Accord Charter Annex 9, Article 31. The Accord's counter-provision against coercive repatriation of settled sanctuary populations cites 12 Valekith precedents from before the collapse, every one of which predates the Colonial Continuity Act itself. The Armada's legal division will need at minimum 48 hours to process the counterfiling in full. Then we have 48 hours, I said. The response fleet will hold the corridor. Yes, she paused, and I watched the amber in her filaments shift slightly darker, which in my experience over many years of reading her meant the harder thing had not arrived yet. But the Armada's senior commander has filed a secondary demand alongside Section 7, a personal address demand. under Velkith Sovereignty Law, Chapter 4, Article 11. I stood very still. I knew Article 11. I had spent 6 weeks on it, 18 years into the review process, when one of the Accord's legal scholars had flagged it in a routine quarterly risk assessment as a provision worth understanding in full, because its implications were unusual. Chapter 4, Article 11 stated that any formal legal demand affecting a Velkith diaspora population under external protection could be answered by the protecting authority through the invocation of the ceremony of continuity of care. It was an archaic provision, older than the Colonial Continuity Act by a significant margin. It predated the sovereignty collapse by a substantial distance and belonged to a period of Velkith legal history when the spoken word carried formal legal weight in ways that subsequent administrative codification had partly displaced but had never entirely erased. Because the Velkith legal tradition did not repeal old law, it added to it, and the old law remained in force beneath. The ceremony had to be spoken by a living representative, not a recording, not a machine rendering of a text, not a certified linguistic proxy authorized to speak on behalf of another party, a living voice in formal High Velkith from a representative of the protecting party. The Velkith had written that requirement in an era before instantaneous communication, before the translation technologies that have since made it technically trivial to render any human utterance in any language in near real time. They had written it that way because, in the deep philosophy that underlies their formal legal tradition, commitment without the cost of genuine learning was not real commitment. A protecting party that had not troubled themselves to actually understand the language of the people they were protecting had not truly chosen to protect those people. They had chosen to accept their presence, which is a different commitment with a different legal and moral weight. The practical implication was that the ceremony required years of preparation to perform validly. The spoken High Velkith that Article 11 specified was not the Velkith spoken in the Calith Shore Community Gardens. It was a ceremonial register that had diverged from the colloquial language approximately 15,000 years before the collapse and had been preserved almost exclusively in formal legal and ritual contexts. The tonal resonance patterns it required were built in the body through extended acoustic practice over a period of years, not something that could be improvised or crash-trained in the hours available. The Accord counterfiling could stall the primary Section 7 claim for months or years of formal adjudication. But during adjudication, the Armada retained the legal standing to issue a voluntary dispersal recommendation to the sanctuary population, a formal encouragement to return that carried no legal force under the Accord's own charter, but carried substantial social and cultural weight within a Velkith community that had spent 34 years on the quiet edge of a question about whether their belonging on Earth was truly permanent. People who have lived that question feel it when someone with formal authority states it aloud, even if the stating carries no legal compulsion. Some of them would act on it. The Accord could win the legal argument in 3 years of adjudication and still watch families leave under the weight of that statement, family by family, over the years it would take to reach a final ruling. The ceremony of continuity, successfully invoked, voided the Article 11 demand entirely. With it went the legal standing for the voluntary dispersal recommendation. It was the one provision in the entire Velkith legal corpus that could close that door completely and immediately, before any family felt the weight of the voluntary recommendation settle on their decisions. The Accord Language Division, I said, has 2 specialists in written Old Velkith. Neither of them can speak the ceremonial register. The spoken and written forms diverged significantly before the collapse, and the spoken form requires tonal resonance patterns that human vocal anatomy cannot produce from text-based study alone, extended acoustic immersion, and dedicated practice over years. The Language Division's assessment is that a minimum of 5 to 7 years of preparation would be required to bring any human speaker to a level the Veilkith Sovereign Registry would recognize as ceremonially valid. She held my gaze without blinking, and the amber in her filaments was perfectly steady now, the steadiness of someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has finally decided to ask it. The Article 11 demand specifies a response window of 6 hours from filing. After that, the demand lapses, and the Section 7 claim proceeds to standard adjudication, with the voluntary dispersal recommendation taking effect immediately. I said nothing. Oren, her voice was very careful, very precise in the way Sale has always been precise when she is carrying something heavy and is determined not to drop it by moving too quickly. During the first 3 years of the Sanctuary Review, when you sat with my sister's archive speakers in the evenings, when you worked with the acoustic tutoring module from our cultural preservation cache, the one that had been in the ship's library for 51,000 years, waiting for a student it never had. I always thought you were doing it because you wanted to understand us. Because that was simply the kind of person you were, curious, patient, willing to spend time on something without an obvious return. That was true, I said. But it was not the only reason. No, I said, it was not the only reason. She was very still. The Accord Language Division flagged Article 11 as a risk vector during the initial legal assessment of the incoming refugee situation, I said. Conducted 47 years ago, before the fleet arrived, before I had any contact with your sister's delegation. They identified the Article 11 spoken ceremony requirement as a provision that could theoretically be invoked at some future point, and that no existing human expertise could meet. They needed someone to learn the spoken ceremonial form, and specifically, they needed that person to also be the primary human contact for the sanctuary population itself, so that if the ceremony was ever invoked, the person speaking it would also be the person who had the relationship, who had spent years in the room, who knew the people they were speaking for, not just the language they were speaking in. I paused. They asked me, before I ever met Vila, before I met you. They told me what Article 11 required, what the preparation would involve, how long it would take, and what they assessed as the probability that I would ever actually use it, which they said was low. They asked me if I would do the work anyway. She waited. I said yes, I said. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I could hear the ventilation system doing its work in the corridor outside. Long enough that I watched her filaments cycle through the amber twice. You have been preparing for this morning for 34 years, she said. Not a question. A thing being held up and examined for whether it was real. I have been maintaining the preparation, I said. I meant that distinction exactly. Spoken High Veilkith does not remain viable in a human memory the way a native language does. It requires regular practice, because the tonal resonance patterns are built as much in the musculature as in the mind. In the specific learned control of secondary resonance, chambers in the jaw, and skull that human anatomy possesses in vestigial form, chambers that the acoustic tutoring module had spent the first year of my training helping me locate and learn to activate deliberately. I had spent 30 minutes every morning for 34 years with that module. My ex-wife had once described it as the strangest meditation practice she had ever lived with. I had told her it was not meditation. She had said it looked the same from the outside, and she was not sure the difference mattered. The Armada's senior commander, I said. Has she specified the timeline? 6 hours from filing, Sale said, which was 43 minutes ago. I moved toward the door. Sale stepped sideways and put her back fully against it. She was not much smaller than me. The Veilkith run slightly taller than the human average and carry more density in their musculature than their proportions suggest. She was not blocking the door in any dramatic physical sense. If I had said please move, she would have moved immediately, and we both knew it. But she put herself against that door with a deliberateness that asked for acknowledgement before navigation, and it stopped me 2 steps away, because some things deserve to be stopped for. "You're not leaving," she whispered. Not a command, not a warning, not an appeal. Something far older and quieter than any of those. The kind of words a person says when they are afraid that the person in front of them has not yet understood that they matter, not to the proceedings, not to the legal outcome, but to her specifically in this room, after 34 years of a relationship built in the margins of official proceedings and the corners of briefing rooms and the occasional correspondence that maintained connection, without fully accounting for what the years had changed. "Sail," I said gently. "I'm not leaving the platform. I need to get to the primary communications suite on deck 3. If I'm going to speak the ceremony, it needs to go through the official accord channel to the Armada's command vessel, with the full legal record transmitted simultaneously and a certified timestamp in the accord registry. The communications suite is the only place on this platform where all three of those things happen at the same time." She looked at me. "I thought," she said, "that you were going to say you needed time, that you needed to consider whether you could still do it, whether 34 years of maintenance had actually held." "I've had 34 years to think about it," I said. The pale green came into her communication filaments then, a color I had no name for in my mental Veilkith lexicon, a color she had never used with me before. I spent several days afterward watching for it in different contexts, trying to understand what emotional or cognitive state preceded it. The word I eventually settled on was not relief, exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of a weight that has been held in careful balance for a very long time, and the hands holding it have not yet set it down. But the decision to set it down has been made, and the decision itself has weight, and the body that made it knows it. She stepped away from the door. The walk to the communications suite on deck 3 took 11 minutes. At priority amber, the Karath Vale's transit corridors move personnel in organized flows to assigned stations, and organized flows rarely accommodate the direction you personally need to go. Sail walked beside me without speaking, which was something I had always valued about her even when she was young. She had learned early, in those first weeks of the sanctuary review when she was sitting in the corner watching everything, that silence during another person's preparation is a form of care and not an absence of it. I used the 11 minutes to do what I had done every morning for 34 years, but had never done while walking a transit corridor. I brought the high Veilkith tonal patterns up through my throat, not voicing them fully, just running the muscle memory, feeling the way the resonance chambers responded to the internal pressure, checking that the preparation had held through the transit and the 6 days on the platform and the previous night in which I had not slept. My acoustic tutoring module had given me its highest certification score in the annual review 8 months earlier. I had noted that score in my log and thought, probably too late to be useful. I had been wrong about that. Commander Aval Soren looked up from the primary console when I walked in. He said, with the particular economy of a person who has been fully briefed on a situation and is not surprised by any development it produces, "Mr. Vale, we've had a standing order to give you the primary channel on request." "Then you know what I need," I said. "Primary hailing link to the Armada command vessel, simultaneous transmission of the full accord counterfiling to their legal division, certified timestamp for the registry." He was already at his console. 4 minutes. The chair they set out for me was a civilian chair brought from the briefing room, because the communication suite's own seating was built for people who operated equipment with their hands. Sail stood to my left, slightly behind me, at the distance of someone who is present without intruding. 2 of the 6 officers in the room had turned their chairs slightly away from me, creating a private space within the shared one. I noticed that and was grateful for it. I spent the 4 minutes not reviewing the words, I knew the words, but settling the body that would produce them. 34 years of morning practice means that the ceremony of continuity lives in me at a level below conscious language. It is in my shoulders and my jaw, and the way my breath moves through my chest. I had never spoken the full ceremony to a Veilkith listener. I had spoken it into the acoustic tutoring module sensor array hundreds of times across the years, and the module's scores had been consistently in the range it described as ceremonially valid for the past 27 years. But there is a difference between a machine's assessment and the living act performed before a living audience, and I did not pretend to myself that I knew with certainty how it would land. What I held was not confidence in the outcome. Outcomes in consequential rooms are not guaranteed, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not spent enough time in them. What I held was the knowledge that the work had been done, that 34 years ago, the Accord had looked at Article 11 and made a decision: prepare. That someone in the language division had written the assessment that said we need a human who can do this, and found me, and I had said yes, and I had done the work every morning since. Earth had not forgotten the day might come. Earth had not assumed it wouldn't. Earth had prepared and maintained the preparation, and the maintenance was itself a kind of promise, the daily promise that the larger promise would be kept. That is what I want people to understand when they ask about that morning. It is not a story about me. I am an old man with aching knees who spent 30 minutes every morning with an alien acoustic tutoring module for 34 years. The story is about what kind of institution we built, and why we built it that way, and what it produces when it is working correctly. Individually, I am a product of a system that identified a future need 47 years in advance, and maintained the preparation across 3 decades of review cycles, without ever assuming the need was too unlikely to warrant the effort. Not because anyone thought it was probable, because we had learned, across generations of building the Accord, that the needs you do not prepare for are the ones that cost the most, and the costs are paid by people who had no say in whether the preparation was made. Channel open, Mr. Vale, you are transmitting. I did not look at the display. I looked at Sale for one moment. She gave me a very small nod. I spoke. The ceremony of continuity of care in High Veilkith is 147 lines in the original written form. In the spoken ceremonial register, with the tonal extensions and the formal cadence structures that Article 11 specifies, it runs considerably longer in clock time. My acoustic tutoring module had always estimated my full rendition at between 20 and 22 minutes at certified competency. When I finished, I did not know how long it had taken. The ceremony does not leave room for that kind of attention alongside itself. It opens with a statement of the protecting relationship, not the speaker's personal identity, but the nature of the relationship being claimed. In High Veilkith, the word for what is being named is something the Accord translation team spent years characterizing. The closest rendering they produced in Accord Standard used 3 phrases across 3 separate translation attempts: a holding that does not own, a caring that does not diminish, a watching that does not confine. The first section of the ceremony is an extended acoustic expression of that concept, built from tonal patterns that the Veilkith ancestral legal tradition considered to be the necessary foundation of any valid protective claim. Without establishing that foundation acoustically in the listener's presence, the middle and final sections carry no ceremonial weight. The middle section addresses the claimant directly. I had studied all 11 historically recorded invocations of the ceremony in my years of preparation. In 8 cases, the claimant had withdrawn following a valid invocation. In 3 cases, they had attempted procedural rejection. None of those 3 rejections had survived review by the Veilkith Sovereign Registry, which had consistently ruled that a ceremony performed in the correct register by a living representative with demonstrated relational standing could not be voided on the basis of non-native production or imperfect tonal fidelity, provided the resonance patterns were within the range the registry defined as recognizable. I spoke the middle section as I had practiced it cleanly, and I did not allow myself to think about what was receiving the transmission on the other end of the channel. The ceremony does not permit divided attention. It asks too much of the body for the mind to be anywhere else. The final section is called the anchor. It does not describe, it does not argue. It declares, in the oldest and most formally structured register of High Velkith, that the protection is continuous, that it predates and will outlast the current legal moment, that the protected relationship exists in time in a way that a single filing cannot interrupt, because filings exist within time, while the relationship that the ceremony names exists across it. The tonal patterns in the anchor were the last ones the module certified as valid in me. In year 7, after 6 years of work on those specific patterns, and they were the ones I had worked hardest to maintain through all the subsequent years, because they were the ones most likely to deteriorate without vigilance. When I finished, the room was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something consequential has just happened, and no one yet knows what it means. Commander Soren's display showed the Armada command vessel had held its channel open for the full duration of the transmission. It continued to hold the channel open for 4 additional minutes after I stopped speaking, during which nothing was transmitted in either direction. A claimant under Article 11 who closes the channel during an invocation is considered, under Velkith law, to have formally rejected the proceedings, a rejection that carries its own set of legal consequences distinct from the underlying claim. The Armada had not closed the channel. The response when it came was in accord standard. The Armada's senior commander, identified in the Accord transliteration system as Sovereign Velkith Authority Prime, spoke in the voice of a person who has encountered something they did not expect and is making careful decisions, in real time, about how much of that surprise to permit into the official record. She said, "The ceremony of continuity has been received and acknowledged under Chapter 4, Article 11 of Velkith Sovereignty Law. This command recognizes the invocation as valid under established sovereign registry precedent. We are suspending the Article 11 personal address demand as of this timestamp. We are additionally suspending the Section 7 primary repatriation, filing pending joint legal review of the Accord counterfiling, transmitted simultaneously with this communication. We request a 72-hour legal hold under joint review protocol." Commander Soren looked at me. "Granted," I said. The platform commander's formal confirmation followed on the secondary channel 14 seconds later. The 72-hour hold became a 9-day legal exchange. The Accord's legal team and the Armada's legal division worked through the 318 million pages of the counterfiling together, line by line, in what the Karath Vale's Records Division afterward described as the most intricate joint review proceedings in the platform's institutional history. The Armada's legal staff were competent and thorough. I want to say that because it is true and because it matters. They were not acting in bad faith. They had been given a legal instrument and sent to use it, and they used it with care. What they had not had access to, because the reconstructed sovereignty had built its legal foundation from post-collapse records, and the pre-collapse corpus existed primarily in the Accord's archive, was the full depth of the law they were invoking. They had the Colonial Continuity Act. They did not have the 4 layers of precedent beneath it. What emerged on the 6th day, on page 41 of an appendix to the Colonial Continuity Act, that the Armada's legal division had not indexed in their initial filing, was a provision in the original pre-collapse Velkith Colonial Charter, older than the Colonial Continuity Act by 8,000 years, and therefore superseding it under Velkith legal hierarchy. That explicitly prohibited the invocation of Section 7 against any diaspora population that had been in continuous settled status under a certified protection grant for more than 30 local year cycles. The sanctuary had been in place for 34 years. The Armada's legal division confirmed the provision's validity after 14 hours of internal review. They came back with it quietly, with the particular quietness of a legal team that has found the clause that ends the argument, and is deciding how to communicate that finding upward to the commanders who sent them here. That same day, Sovereign Velkith Authority Prime requested a direct communication with me, not through official channels, through Sale. Sale brought the request to the small observation lounge the platform commander had assigned me for the duration of the hold, because going back and forth to the transit pod every night was making my knees worse. She sat across from me and relayed the message word for word, without editorial addition, in the way she does when she wants it clear that the words belong to someone else. The commander wanted to know how long I had been preparing to speak the ceremony. 34 years, I told Sale to tell her. There was a pause, then the commander wanted to know why. Because we made a promise when we granted the sanctuary, I said. Keeping a promise requires preparation. We did not know what kind of preparation we would need, so we prepared for all of it. The pause this time was longer than transmission delay accounted for. The commander's final message came back in 4 words of High Velkith, not a standard formulation, not sourced from any ceremonial corpus I had studied, not from any of the 1,140 pages of recorded Velkith diplomatic speech in the Accord's archive. A spontaneous utterance. Sale translated it slowly, because the inflection was one she had not encountered before, and she wanted to render it correctly. She says, Sale told me, we did not build that. I sat with that for a while. Then I said to Sale, not for relay, not for the record, just for the 2 of us in the observation lounge with the stars outside the port, and the armada's remaining vessels visible at the outer berth marker as lights that had stopped advancing. Tell me something. When you were young and you sat in the corner of the briefing room watching me work, did you know then what the acoustic sessions were for? She was quiet for a moment. Then, I thought you were doing it because you liked us. Because you wanted to understand us well enough to speak to us in our own language. Both things were true, I said. But one of them was also preparation. Yes. She looked at me, and the pale green came back into her communication filaments. Fuller this time, steadier, and I was beginning to understand what it was, though I still did not have a precise word for it. I want to tell you something I have never told anyone, she said. When I was 14 years old, 3 years after the sanctuary was granted, during the first 10-year review period, I found the acoustic tutoring module in your study locker. You had left it on the ledge outside the locker. I played one of the session recordings. She paused. You were not very good at the anchor yet. No, I agreed, year 4. I wasn't. But you went through all 47 lines, and when you finished you started again from the beginning. I sat on the floor of the corridor outside your study and I listened to you practice for 2 hours. She looked at her hands. I was 14 and I did not have words for the thought I was having, but the thought was something like, they are going to keep us safe. Not only because they have the weapons for it, though they have those, because they have the patience for it. They are going to sit in a room every morning and learn the words they may never need, and they are going to do it anyway. And that is the difference between a promise and a guarantee. I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, that is the difference. I know that now, she said. I think I knew it then, I just could not say it. On the 9th day of the legal hold, the Velkith Sovereignty Armada filed a voluntary suspension of all repatriation proceedings under the pre-collapse colonial charter provision that the Accord counterfiling had surfaced and the Armada's own legal division had confirmed. The Armada's senior commander issued a formal statement acknowledging the validity of the Accord's sanctuary grant and the legal standing of the settled population under the terms of both the Accord Charter and the Velkith Colonial Charter, as it predated the Colonial Continuity Act. 26 of the 29 vessels departed under clean withdrawal protocol. 3 remained in orbit, at Sovereign Velkith Authority Prime's request and not the Accords, assigned a diplomatic berth at the outer platform marker. She had framed it precisely. The question of the diaspora population's cultural relationship with the reconstituted sovereignty was a separate question from the question of jurisdiction, and it deserved to be treated separately, on its own timeline and through its own process, without the shadow of the legal demand behind it. The Accord platform commander agreed. 719 families living in the Caliph Shore residential district went to bed on the 9th night not knowing how close the question had come. I went home 2 days after the 3 vessels were berthed. My knees were in a condition my physician described without humor as protesting loudly, and the sinus situation had resolved in the predictable direction. I had 3 weeks of backed-up correspondence and a formal request from the Accord Registry to deposit the full institutional record of my high Velkith acoustic maintenance practice. All 34 years of session logs, module certification scores, and the tutoring module itself, so that the methodology could be documented and preserved as part of the legal record of the ceremony's invocation. I wrote back that I would do it. I also wrote that they should consider assigning the same preparation to someone else. Not as a replacement for me, I am not irreplaceable and I know it, but as a continuation. Because the Velkith sovereignty's diplomatic exchange with the settled population would take years, and the years after that were not predictable, and the ceremony of continuity remains valid law, and a preparation that has already been proven valid is worth maintaining even when there is no immediate threat that requires it. They wrote back within 2 hours. They had already identified a candidate. She was 31 years old and had been in the Accord Language Division for 6 years and had the strongest documented secondary resonance chamber development their assessment team had ever measured in a human subject. They asked if I would consult on her training. I said yes. The morning after I returned to my apartment, before I answered the rest of the correspondence, I ran my 30-minute acoustic maintenance session. The same session I had run every morning for 34 years. High Velkith tonal patterns, opening identity statement through the middle section through all 47 lines of the anchor, at full ceremony pace. At the end of it, I sat in the chair by my window that faces the water, and I thought about Sail sitting on the floor of a corridor when she was 14 years old, listening to me work badly through something I had promised I would eventually learn to do well, deciding without words that her people were going to be kept safe. I thought about the person in the language division. I never learned their name, and I have tried to find it in the institutional records without success, who wrote the assessment 47 years ago that said, "We need a human who can do this, and we need to find them now, before the situation has any urgency, while there is still time to do the work correctly." That person is almost certainly dead. They will never know their assessment was right, or that the human they found did the work for 34 years before needing to use it, or that the Velkith commander on the other end of the channel held the line open for 4 minutes after the ceremony ended because she needed time to understand what she had just heard. They wrote an assessment that became, 47 years later, 719 families in a community garden on the shore of the Atlantic. They did their work. The work did the rest. I thought about 34 years of 30-minute mornings that no one witnessed and no one needed to witness, because the record kept itself, because that is what we built, because we learned long ago that a promise requires preparation to be real, and intention without preparation protects no one from anything, and the families in the Caliph Shore community gardens deserved better than our good intentions. The water outside my window was doing what water does, moving. Not knowing or caring about orbital platforms or legal archives or the secondary resonance chambers in the jaw of an old man who runs the same practice session every morning because someone asked him to once, and he said yes, and has been saying yes every morning since. In 30 minutes, A 31-year-old language division officer will receive an email asking if she would like to begin training in spoken High Velkith under the consultation of a retired watch officer with 34 years of documented preparation behind him. She will say yes, or she will say no. If she says yes, she will spend the next several years of her mornings learning something she may never use. And if the day comes when she uses it, she will be ready, because that is what the institution we built is for, carrying the preparation forward past the edge of any one person's life, across the distance between the promise and the day it is needed, however many years lie between. I turned away from the window and started on the correspondence. There is still a great deal of work to do.